Why hate brutalism? Part 1. Factories for living.
I mean, I remember once standing outside on a rainy day, and there's this small woman with an umbrella, and she said, "Do you want to have shelter?" I said, "Yes, thank you." And we started talking as one does in the rain, and she said, "What do you think of this building?" For the Pompidou. And stupidly, which I would never normally do, I said, "I designed it," and she hit me on the head with the umbrella. It was just, that was sort of typical of the general reaction of the people.
If you were to ask 10 people off the street what they thought of brutalist architecture, I'd wager that the vast majority would say that they hate it. They'd call it ugly, especially after a few years of weathering, stained by pollution and rusting rebar. Others might claim that brutalist buildings make them feel small and insignificant, especially when they're forced to rush across vast open spaces of blank concrete and glass, exposed like rats scurrying to the safety of the nearest human-scale bolt hole. And they wouldn't be wrong. People hate brutalism, architecture's most extreme post-war style, because they are meant to hate it. Unlike much of architecture throughout history, reaching back to ancient Athens, which almost bankrupted itself building the Parthenon, brutalism is not an architecture that celebrates life or God or beauty. Instead, it is the physical articulation of nihilism and the will to power that excuses the ends justifying the means policy disasters we see all around us.
Let the past die. Kill it if you have to.
Brutalism and what came to be known as the International style were both heavily influenced by the Weimar German Bauhaus school and the theories of visionary, some would say megalomaniac, French artist and architect Le Corbusier. Philip Johnson, noted architect and the chief popularizer of this style in America, coined the term international style to help sell what were essentially collectivist ideals into the heart of 1950s Mad Men corporate culture.
The international style was a very severe, definite movement, such as we haven't seen since the Gothic.
Reeling from the unprecedented carnage of World War I Europe, many artists were searching for answers after the collapse of four great empires: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, which had left a generation of young men dead and much of Europe in crisis. Some, like author J.R.R. Tolkien, brought whole new worlds into existence, reteaching forgotten moral lessons in the hope that future generations might avoid his generation's mistakes. While others blamed the corrupt and decrepit bourgeoisie culture of the Academy for all their ills.
All the buildings that later on became the buildings that we see all around us are all international style, and so the name stuck because it was true. I mean, it was a discipline of architecture that avoided ornament, that had flat roofs, that had lots of glass and ribbons of glass, and stucco or plain materials, and no capitals, and naturally no orders, and the Beaux-Arts was castigated.
They dreamt of new ways of living, a moral utopia of peace and international brotherhood where wars and the borders that caused them were both abolished. Revolution was in the air in 1920s Europe, especially in Weimar Germany, where the newly founded Bauhaus school was obsessively stripping away any and all decoration, cleansing their design language of every last vestige of the aristocratic salon culture and mindset they blamed for the civilizational crisis they were experiencing. This sentiment was clearly articulated in the Bauhaus Manifesto written by founder Walter Gropius in 1919. Quote, "The ornamentation of the building was once the main purpose of the visual arts. Today they exist in complacent isolation, from which they can only be salvaged by the purposeful and cooperative endeavors of all artisans."
And we thought we'd saved the world. It was almost a moral movement.
In other words, they were seeking to completely overturn what they saw as a decadent European society so that they could build a shining new paradise on a clean blank slate, swept clear of this despised past. But this trend wasn't without its critics, even back then. Oscar Niemeyer, the modernist Brazilian architect well known for his many monumental structures, was strongly influenced by Le Corbusier's use of concrete, while being repelled at the same time by the overly mechanistic tendencies of both Bauhaus and the Swiss master, preferring to draw his inspiration from the natural shapes found in the jungles, rivers, and mountains all around him, until he was forced to flee his beloved homeland because of his open communist affiliations. Quote, "We hated Bauhaus. It was a bad time for architecture. They just didn't have any talent. All they had were rules. Even for forks and knives, they created rules. Picasso would never have accepted rules. The house is like a machine? No. The mechanical is ugly. The rule is the worst thing. You just want to break it." In contrast, Brutalism fully embraced the austere simplicity of Bauhaus. Works such as Toronto's TD Centre by its greatest master, Mies van der Rohe, perfectly exemplified this obsession to do away with any unnecessary ornamentation, stripping each structure down to its fundamentals. But where the former focused on craftsmanship and the finest materials to enrich this otherwise stark minimalism, the Brutalist embraced the moral purity of raw concrete. The international style became the siren cry of modernization, a necessary element of any forward-thinking city, influencing the look of skylines around the world, while at the same time creating both the technology and market conditions for what was to come.
Since I understood that, I would not be for fashion in architecture. I would look for more profound principles. The answer of this question, gave me the direction which I followed, not what I liked. I throw often things out I like very much, but when I have a better idea, a clearer idea, then I follow the clearer idea.
This direct lineage from Bauhaus to Brutalism can be clearly seen in this early example, the Hunstanton School in Norfolk, England, designed by Allison and Peter Smithson, which Philip Johnson praised at the time in the Architectural Review, August 1954, as, quote, not only radical but also very Mies-like in its nature. Johnson went so far as to claim that, although the architects never saw the work of the Bauhaus master, they understood the style of, quote, exposed steel, glass, and brick-filled frame grammar more successfully than anyone else. But there were significant differences to the Bauhaus as well.
We used to talk of objects as found. That is, anything and everything can be raised by association to become the poetry of the ordinary. Johnson
concluded his critique of the work prophetically. Here is a radicalism which owes nothing to precedent and everything to the inner mechanisms of the modern movement. It does not merely imply a special kind of plan or structure, but a particular ruthlessness overriding gentlemen's agreements and routine solutions, which pervades the whole design from original conception to finished details.
So that in addition to being a discipline of architecture, there was a very profound philosophy where you really believed that architecture would make a difference.
We did believe it. Corbusier once said people will be better people if they live behind glass.
This ruthlessness can also be traced to that other towering figure of modernism, Swiss-French artist and architect Le Corbusier, whose grandiose ideas, expressed in a series of essays in the early 1920s, envisioned an architecture that would fundamentally change how humans interacted with buildings. Human form, in other words, would be re-engineered to better follow modernist functionality. Le Corbusier is in many ways the true father of Brutalism, even giving the movement its name, which was derived from a pun coined by architectural critic Reynard Banham in his 1955 article, The New Brutalism, where he made fun of an outraged general public's early reaction to the style. Béton brut being a translation of the French for raw concrete, Le Corbusier's preferred medium of expression. Brutalism's adherents among cosmopolitan artists and intellectuals fully embraced Le Corbusier's dictum that a house should be a machine for living. Society needed a master planner capable of designing utopia, based on the latest science. And by the 1960s, Brutalists were in a position to bring Le Corbusier's dream of endless concrete factories for living to life. Although Paris was luckily spared his Plein Voisin, which had envisioned much of the City of Light's right bank replaced by a series of bleak, monotonous high-rises. Many town centers and working-class neighborhoods and places like post-war England were not so lucky. Utopian dreams for better living ended up producing monstrosities such as London's massive Thamesmead housing development, hated by many of its residents. Although it did provide a cheap, ready-made backdrop for Stanley Kubrick's dystopian masterpiece, Clockwork Orange.
At the turn of the century, architects dreamed of garden cities, and in every town and village in England we see council houses built and building right up till today, which are the children of the garden city idea. And in the 20s, in the heroic period of modern architecture, the models, the prototypes developed on the continent for a simple, clean, sun-giving architecture are now being built in England in the 60s. What we have now is people living in these clean, sun-drenched boxes with fitted carpets inside and vandalism outside.
People hate brutalism because they are meant to hate it. Its often monumental scale, bland materials, and overall coldness is designed to degrade both nature and the human spirit. Unlike the messy, vibrant public areas, it displaces where human contact and interaction are encouraged. Its vast empty spaces and blank interchangeable walls of glass, brick, or concrete seem designed to encourage antisocial behavior. It, along with much of modern art, were an early manifestation of the everything is political thinking that has come to define the culture wars raging all around us. Instead of creating environments designed to uplift people's spirits or provide a respite from the drudgery of our daily lives, its message is stop resisting and embrace the machine. Stop thinking, listen, and believe. It is a utopia that, for all its fine words and promises of a better future, delivers the endless horrors of Orwell's jackboot instead.